Okay, so I want to just begin with a few things just to follow up on what we talked about last week. Because these 2 weeks we focused on image classification. So last time we focused on unsupervised classification. We also talked about the basics, the fundamentals of image classification. What are the major concepts? And also, we just did this activity on what are the elements we use. So actually, even if we use a computer, we use some algorithms to classify the image. But in general, they're actually just all gonna simulate the way human eyes are, basically doing to identify different ground features. So, all these big terms people are talking about right now, like the deep learning, machine learning. So essentially, it's all about identifying the different patterns. So I also want to follow up on a few terminologies, which if you have started on lab 6, the unsupervised classification, you will have a general idea. So I want to differentiate between spectral classes or spectral clusters versus information classes, which, if you're reading different textbook or if you're reading different remote sensing papers, sometimes they may refer to these two types of classes using this term. So I want to clarify the terms. So the general ideas or the challenges, as we have been experimenting so far, pixels of the same land cover class may actually show very different spectral signatures. So we know, I'm sure you folks still remember, some of the labs we did where you will be picking a few samples of the same land cover class. For example, you pick 3 different buildings. Some are really bright and some are kind of in between and some are darker. So all the different building pixels, they may show very different spectral patterns. So which is really one of the major challenge when we classify an image, and that's really why new classification algorithms are being developed. So for spectral classes or clusters, they refer to these clusters or classes of pixels that are relatively uniform with respect to their brightness values in the the different bands. So basically, whenever we're talking about a spectral class, we refer to a class of uniform pixels with very similar, if not identical, spectral signatures. So when you plot them on a spectral signature plot, you will see them showing the same trend. Maybe they're higher on near infrared and a little high on green and lower on the red and blue, and also some other mid infrared or far infrared or even longer wavelengths. But also, like in remote sensing, the end product, what we're really interested is to produce a map, a layer with information classes. So for information classes, we usually refer to the categories of interest to the users of the data. So those would be, really the land use and land cover classes. For example, in lab 6, we did 7 different information classes. However, if you folks remember, in the lab, we initially, through the unsupervised classification, we generated 30 to 35, because we're using ISO data, so we generated over 30 spectral classes. And eventually, we're going to combine the 35 into the 7 information classes. And also, what really makes things more challenging is we know, the ground features are going to be very complex. So sometimes pixels within the same information class, they may be categorized into the different spectral clusters. And what makes things even worse, makes things even more challenging is for the pixels within the same spectral classes, somehow they may actually refer to different information classes. So this really makes this image classification process challenging. I'm sure if you have been working on lab 6 or finalizing lab 6, you should be realizing the problem. Sometimes you're just trying to identify or trying to label one of the spectral clusters, and you just zoom to the different locations, and some of them have very isolated pixels. It's really hard to identify which ones are they. And also sometimes you see, well, in the same spectral cluster, some pixels may refer to Bearland, but also some other classes, some other pixels within the same cluster, somehow they may refer to buildings and farms. So Overall, this confusion between spectral classes and information classes, the spectral confusions has been creating the challenge. And also, in addition, people are trying to figure out new algorithms or new methodology to try to solve the problem, which is very common. So just to use the lab as an example, I'm using a different image here. I'm using the Chicago Sentinel image, which I used in previous classes. So for unsupervised classification, you identify the number of classes here. So this number of classes, and they actually refer to the spectral classes or the spectral clusters. So once you generate a certain number of spectral classes, you will be using the different techniques. You can use Google Earth, you can use your ground truthing data, you can use the original image as a reference. So anyways, whichever reference data you use, the second step is about assigning information classes to the different clusters. And we mentioned how challenging it can grow. So I'm sure like once you are the first couple of classes will be easy because usually the first couple of classes will refer to water. And then once you get to the 10s or the 11s, things will get more confusing. And within one spectral class, you see multiple land covers, but somehow you have to make a decision and move on, and your map won't be perfectly accurate. To actually solve the problem, there are many different techniques people can use. And actually, well, I guess I will be looking for your response to question 5 that I'm sure some of you will have good suggestions, either from your maybe reading external sources or some ideas you just somehow came up through doing this experiment. So one quick idea is you can actually increase the number of spectral clusters. Because if you really increase the number of spectral classes to generate, then more likely, the confusing classes can be separated. So that's, one possible way, but also, that means if you're generating 200 different spectral classes, you really have to go through all the 200 different spectral clusters and label them. So that means more work. However, oftentimes that's a key way to improve your accuracy. And actually, it's going to be pretty efficient because, we know maybe there are 100 pixels and they refer to different classes. But if you further separate them into 5 smaller clusters, very likely, the buildings can be separated from other confusing classes. And in addition, there may be additional techniques you can try, which you don't have to apply in the lab, but something for your consideration, either for your final project or maybe for your future project, especially for the graduate folks. So one of this textbook approach is called a multi-stage approach, or sometimes people would call it a stratified approach. So what they're really doing is, we begin with the original image, and then we found out there's one class that is super confusing. And somehow, no matter how much more clusters I generate, the classification algorithm just wouldn't further classify this confusing class. So one typical approach is to say, okay, since if we consider the entire image, this class is confusing, then what about we take them out? And then we only apply the ISO data or k-means or some other algorithms to this confusing class so that we can target the problem class and to further classify them. So what this diagram is showing you is, for example, the black class is, the black colored class is actually very confusing. So they decided to take it out and then to further apply the same algorithm again to this confusing class so that we further, if we rate the shades, they're further classifying this confusing class into 3 smaller classes. So that's a second stage or like a second layer, second stratified classification to further, try to tell them apart. And once we have the 3 classes, you will be, so what they talked about, the recoded, which is actually to do this labeling. And actually in Earth Imagine, there is a tool called Recode, which is very similar to the Reclassify tool within ArcGIS Pro. So really, these 2 programs are similar, and they have, and especially for raster processing, they have similar tools. So I'm going to just send you the name. So recode is in ERDAS, which is pretty much identical to the reclassify to in ArcGIS. So I know many of you have taken both classes, but just in case, for your information. So once we have the recoding process done, and then we can combine the second stage results with original large image to cover our original study area. So this stratified approach or this multi-stage approach is very commonly used in remote sensing to further refine your results. And this is usually happening after you first try a few things, and after you try the first several rounds and you feel like there's no way that you can further improve the results and you have to do something else. And this is this multi-stage approach. And you can actually, speaking of multi-stage, this diagram is showing you 2 stages. You can actually do 3 stage, 4 stage, 5 stage until you're satisfied with your final map. So that really points out something I've been talking about. Remote sensing is going to be a time-consuming process. Sometimes you spend the first 2 weeks on trying something. And the 2 weeks I'm talking about not only 1 hour or 2 every day, I'm talking about 12 hours a day. And then you realize what you have been doing are, they're not wrong because they tell you, something that is not going to work. And then you have to come up with another things. And that's really the common procedure of remote sensing. It's time consuming. It's not like GIS that you just click on a tool and you run, you get your results. Maybe it's not working, you can try something else, but it's usually pretty quick. But remote sensing, there are a lot of, back and forth, and sometimes you have to apply your statistical knowledge to further analyze your pixels, the spectral patterns, in order to improve your results. So that's the general ideas of a multi-stage approach. And then coming back to the last slide from our last Monday's class. So I brought up this common issue, which I'm sure you will see in this lab as well. So there's a general challenge of trying to differentiate between agricultural land. So speaking of agricultural land, there may be different stages of crop growth. So it's very common to have a fallowed land that they're just kind of looks like bare land and there's just no water. And generally speaking, they look very similar to the transitional land in the urban area. And there's a common confusion. Really, I'm not really trying to exaggerate the problem because for myself, like every remote sensing project, one of the major challenges I have to deal with because I do focus on urban area a lot. So, sometimes I do like forest area deforestation, but for most of the research I do is always urban. So speaking of urban, I'm not only looking at the urban core, urban center, I'm also looking at the whole metro, which will have, partially agricultural land, farmland. So this confusion is something I have to deal with every single time. It's very time consuming. So you can see their spectral signatures are even almost identical. So of course, if you're only using the 6 bands spectral information, no matter what algorithm you use or no matter how much money you spend, maybe you buy a new program, but either way, they're not going to solve the problem because essentially they're the same data. So how do you tell them apart? So spectral information is not enough. What you have to do is really have to bring in additional information. So that's really why we started with activity today. In addition to the color, the brightness, additional things you can use. You can use like Simon mentioned texture, some of you mentioned the size, and some of you mentioned, the general location, the angles, all of the information you can use. But, the challenge is how do you translate the texture, the spatial information, all the different size information, shape information into GIS, into remote sensing to solve your problem. So one example I did, which was from one of my paper published in 2013. So that was in grad school. So one of my first remote sensing project. What I did is basically the multiple stage classification, but instead of just taking a confusing class out, I applied another layer of spatial analysis. So for those of you who have taken 392, we mentioned the kernel density. So this is actually one of the applications of kernel density. In addition to make a density map, make a heat map, there are different ways you can apply your JS knowledge into some other area to improve the results. So here I used the kernel density to further, basically, I brought in the layer of my street center line data for the metro area of Atlanta, and then just basically look at the pattern of the street center line, and I realized really visually you can see how the density kind of matching up with the distribution of urban area. Since my major challenge is to try to differentiate between the urban transitional land with the fallowed agricultural land. So what I was trying to do is I want to figure out a way to separate the urban area with the rural area so that I can apply the classification to them separately, without confusing, the two portions. So I try to separate them spatially. So what I did is a density analysis, kernel density, and then I applied a threshold value, based on some experiment so that I can separate between my urban subsite and my rural subsite. So in addition to the kernel density, I also did road buffering so that I know, just looking at the nearby area within within the road center line, I would consider them to be part of the urban. So I think I probably mentioned this. While this process took me 7 hours. This is what I'm talking about. So basically, as you folks can see, my urban subsites, the polygon shapes are very complex. So this separation between urban and rural, just trying to, once I got my urban polygon, and I try to separate the original interior image into an urban subsite and then rural subsite, this process took 7 hours. And it wasn't a single 7 hour. It was actually, I did a lot of test before and after. So this whole process, what I'm showing you is a very simple diagram. This overall process took me over a month because I started with trying to classify the entire image because I didn't know the problem back then because, we didn't really talk about all this in class. It was just all from my experiment. And I spent 2 weeks here on classify the entire image and realized it's not going to work. And then spend another 2 weeks and trying to figure out what I can do to improve the results. And once I figure out, trying to figure out, the polygon to separate urban and rural, it took me another 2 weeks. And eventually, just basically until my advisor told me, you have to stop and move on because otherwise there's no end. And that's really how I was able to finalize the whole procedure in over a month because otherwise I'm sure I would be easily spend a half year on this. So after this, I applied supervised classification, which is what we're going to talk about today on each of the two subsites. And then I did classification separately. And eventually I combined them to generate the final map, which I found, apparently because it helped me tell these two confusing classes apart, the urban transitional land and also the fallowed agricultural land. I was able to improve my results largely. And also for those of you who has the GIS knowledge, definitely folks know digitizing. So as part of the process of preparing the urban polygon, I also used digitizing to edit my polygons because after running the density analysis, it largely covers what I would consider as urban, but also it's challenging because, think about airports or, some other very large facilities, large buildings in the relatively remote and rural region where the road density is relatively low. So when after I applied density analysis, somehow the airport was still considered as rural because, as you know, the road density, the street center line data, the road density is low there. So after I applied the threshold, somehow airport was spatially categorized as rural. So I had to digitize the polygon there roughly to just kind of delineate, to make sure the airport goes with my urban polygon. So there are a lot of small process and everything will eventually come together. So it's just all about, actually, I think remote sensing is interesting because there are a lot of opportunities for you to apply all your JS knowledge from JS1, from JS2, from of course, remote sensing, and you can even apply more advanced techniques, your vector analysis and raster analysis, and eventually to help you improve the results. So really here, there's nothing super statistical. Like the whole process is something very easy to apply for any geographers who knows GIS without having to design a super technical process or like some complex statistical model. So I think sometimes it's just really interesting to apply what do you know, because there are a lot of opportunities for people to reapply and replicate your procedures. So just a quick summary. So besides spectral information, what else can we use in image classification? So we did this activity together. So you folks pointed out a few things we can use in image interpretation, the visual elements, and the same idea can apply to this automatic image classification process as well. So at the pixel level, individual pixel level, we didn't really get a chance to do a lot of radar because, there are some complex issues which, well, ideally, hopefully in the future, we can add a radar remote sensing class so that we can have one class to focus on radar. But we mentioned briefly how radar can give you the polarization information. So, remember like the horizontally transmitted, horizontally received, or horizontally transmitted, vertically received. So those are your additional information. They're not spectral, but they have pixel level information. And those information can be used for you to identify different ground covers. And they're basically similar to the texture information. For example, we know spectrally like a plantation may be similar to a forest land, to a natural forest. However, if you bring in the radar image, the polarization, very likely, the man-made plantations will show very different polarization characteristics when compared to natural forest. So those are the additional pixel level information. So they're basically pixel values at each pixel that you can use in the image classification. And in addition, temporal patterns. So right now, there are many research, like in the past 10 or 20 years, researchers are actually merging or stacking images collected at a different time and different season and try to, like put them all into the classification process. So, remember, I think in lab 4, many of you asked about what do you stack? So, for the basic form, of course, we just stack image from the same source, from all Landsat 8, band 1 through band 7. So we stack them and just try to use the spectral information in your analysis. However, you think about the image stacking process, you can really control what you want to stack. So really, like, if you have another layer of radar polarization, and you, of course, you want to resample to make sure the image size is, the pixel size is the same as your other layer. So you can actually stack one more layer from radar polarization so that you have one more variable in your classification. And in addition, maybe you're thinking about trying to classifying some species. For example, if you're classifying an image collected maybe in the summer season, you will likely see depending on the resolution, very likely the evergreen trees versus the deciduous forest, they show very similar spectral patterns because they're just all in this full growing mode. However, some people are trying to merge or stacking additional image from the winter season, where you will actually see the difference between deciduous versus evergreen. So you will have, you can really like control what layers you stack as long as you're certain it's going to help your classification. And then you can stack maybe a Landsat image, Landsat 8 image collected in the same year, but in January or in December or in February, and so that you have data from multiple seasons to help your classification. So really just try to generalize all these ideas. There are some opportunities for you to bring in additional information to improve classification. But also, for this class, I felt like, because really, we're only offering this one remote sensing, but also I think it's important to start from doing the basics. So we'll just still like feel free to use your, like all Landsat image from the same source. I think we're not really there yet to, talk about how to improve. But once you have, the basic land use and land cover map classified from the spectral information, maybe you can, think about what you can do in the future. Or, if you're really ambitious, you can try to bring in some additional layers or additional information to see if how much you can improve by bringing this additional pixel level information. So in addition to the pixel level, we also know there are some spatial information. So speaking of spatial, I meant not only this individual pixel, the target pixel you're looking at, but also maybe the surrounding pixels, the environment, the context. So for example, you can use the image texture. So actually in ERDAS and also in every remote sensing program, there is usually a group of tools called texture analysis. So this texture analysis, to translate into your raster GIS knowledge, is basically a neighborhood, a focal neighborhood analysis. So what they do is they compare the target pixel with their neighbors, with their surrounding pixels. So you can define how large of a neighborhood you can look at. You can compare this pixel with the surrounding 8 pixels, or you can also define whether you're only whether you want to look at the corner pixels or not. So you can define how you want to compute or characterize the texture information, and this is the information you can use once again as an additional layer stack in your classification. Pixel proximity, for example, we'll actually use a video to make sense here, and you can consider size, shape, and angles, directionality. So you can really compute all of this into some sort of pixel value and then use them in your classification. Or they don't necessarily have to be a pixel value, but you can really, for example, like I did, computing the kernel density of a street center line, and then you can further separate your landscape into 2 subsites. So the spatial information can be applied as pixel values, but also can be applied just as maybe a process separation, segmentation. So all of this information you can use, and of course you can consider the spatial context. So and today we're going to focus on a couple others. So today is our second session on image classification. Really image classification deserves more time actually, but also I felt like it's actually important to start with the basics, and and then you folks can play around with the different options, and you will learn from your own experience, your own experiment in the lab, and then in the final project. So today, for the second session of image classification, we're going to focus on a couple things. So we'll begin with 2 quick examples of the spatial classifier we just mentioned. The first one is called object-oriented classification. So, if you have been reading articles, publications in remote sensing, or, somehow I think if you're doing something like urban-related or land cover-related, you will more or less have been exposed to the different terminologies. So object-oriented classification is one of the very commonly used approach, a spatial classifier that is very special. We'll talk about with examples, and also I'll mention, what are the programs or the challenges there. We'll also mention quickly the contextual classification, which is more like a GIS process. And today, for our true focus, is going to be the supervised classification, which we'll be doing in lab 7. We'll use the same data. So it's your opportunity to compare unsupervised versus supervised classification, still the Twin Cities area. With this, basically now you should be familiar with the land cover. So now you can really apply a different process and see, I'm sure there will be some discussion on which one you prefer. So we'll wait until maybe after the spring break and to see what's your preference. And we can, once we get there, we can compare the 2 different processes. And also we'll have a review assignment, the third review assignment. So in this class, we have 4 review assignments in total. And the third one, I would consider the third one to be the biggest one because you folks have to give a presentation, which will be, so we're basically getting started earlier, but the presentation is scheduled for later this semester. So you will have more time to collect some examples and articles. Well, so we'll mention, but this isn't due until, yeah, I don't quite remember the due date, but in the syllabus and also in the schedule page. So it isn't really due until the 1 week before the presentation days. So you will definitely have a lot of time, and maybe you already have some examples that are ready to go. Let me make sure that I share my computer sound. So let me know if you have trouble hearing this video.
Welcome. The topic of this short film is object-based computer image analysis. Object what, you might say? Okay, let's stick to the basic principles by way of an introduction to object-based image analysis. Let's begin with a relatively simple example. For task number 1, we've chosen to extract water from a remote sensing dataset. This is how to classify water. When visually inspecting the dataset, water areas are immediately recognized. But how's a computer-based method possible? The first reaction is to say all blue pixels are water, but this causes a problem with especially high-resolution data where many pixels are also blue, but maybe other things entirely. Humans aggregate similar things in an image into groups and distinguish different shapes and spatial relations. Definian's image segmentation applies the same technique automatically. Attributes such as the texture of an area, its shape, and even its context can be given, making water areas easily recognizable. To make things a bit more interesting, we added a second task, separating the rivers from the lakes. Again, think about how we as humans solve this task. The color as such is of no help, so next we look at the shape of the areas. Shape is the key to separating the rivers from the lakes. There's still one obstacle though. All water areas are split up into small objects which don't represent the distinctive shapes of rivers or lakes. This is overcome by merging objects based on their classification. As a result, we've effectively identified both the water bodies and the water body types. Definian software.
Okay, so we're gonna stop here because they're going to talk about the software. So for object-oriented classification, so basically the short clip give you a general idea of how object-oriented classification works. So the idea is instead of doing the pixel-based, so the object-oriented is actually in contrast to the pixel level, pixel-based classification. So really, when you talk about classification, there are different levels. So by in the default form, we do pixel level classification. So like what we did in lab 6 and also lab 7, our basic element is the individual image pixels. We classify the pixels into different categories. So there's also the object-oriented classification, which they will first group your similar pixels into individual objects. So they would basically consider the spectral information. So if this pixel is similar to its surrounding pixels, it will just homogeneous spatially, they will consider this group of pixels as an object. So of course, they will just think about their size and shape and texture, and all of them are based on the spectral patterns. And this process is known as image segmentation. So I'm also going to send the term to the chat as well. So if you're using some remote sensing program, actually in Erda's Imagine, there's also an image segmentation tool, which is used to segment your image into homogeneous objects, so which will be basically consider the spectral and spatial information. So once you have the objects identified, well, basically the objects will become the elements for your classification. So, as opposed to doing pixel level classification, You can then, for the second process, basically you'll be applying your traditional conventional classification procedure, whether it's supervised or unsupervised, on the objects as opposed to the pixels. So this will really ensure that this object will go together, and which will also make your identification of the objects easier. Because I'm sure if you're finishing Lab 6, you will realize some classes are really tricky to identify. You just see this isolated individual pixels scattered across the landscape, and some in the urban area, some in the forest. It's just really hard to even pinpoint which pixel you're really looking at. So in object-oriented classification, it's not going to be the problem, because you're not really looking at individual pixels anymore. You're looking at objects, which is a cluster, a group of pixels altogether. But there's a condition for that. So actually, object-oriented classification, they're only supposed to be used for high resolution, for classifying high resolution imagery. So which means in Lab 6 and Lab 7, we use Landsat 8 for the 30-meter resolution data. Even if you have a really nice object-oriented classification software, or you have this algorithm, it just won't work really well. You can try, you can definitely try and just learn the lesson for yourself. But object-oriented classification, like, basically the beginning of the video also mentioned, it's designed to solve the problem within the high resolution imagery. So, for example, our Iconus image, the one we used in the first couple of labs, and also this other, the group of other images, the commercial satellite we mentioned a couple weeks ago, for example, World View, the 1, 2, 3, 4, and also, QuickBird, all this commercial satellites, which means the data won't be free. And also, even though ERDAS and also some other program, they do have the object-based classification tools. However, speaking of the regular object-oriented classification, there's a program called Cognition. So I send you the name of the program in the chat. So that's a very specially designed program for running object-oriented classification, which is more expensive than ERDAS Imagine and also ArcGIS Pro. So it's actually just very specific tool sets designed for running this process of object-oriented classification. But I just want to mention the idea, just in case you will get the opportunity to work with high-resolution image and also get to run this program that is designed for running this object-oriented classification. And also, I want to just mention another term. So we mentioned pixel-based classification, object-oriented classification, and there's another level, which will be so object will be combining multiple pixels, which is used as individual elements in your classification. And pixel level is individual pixel. And there's another level called subpixel analysis. And the subpixel analysis would allow you to basically, and identify information within a pixel. So we'll mention the idea. I'll have a slide later on to show you what a subpixel analysis does. So in addition to the object-oriented classification, there is another easier to implement classification process called contextual classification. So the contextual classification will use the spatial context of a pixel or of some classes to further refine your classification. So what they consider is the context, the geographical context, the relative location of the pixel or the classes to other regions. One simple example, which is really a simplification of the process, like whenever you're running this contextual classification, you have to really do some comprehensive field survey and also acquire the local knowledge of your study area before you can apply some rules that may apply to all your classes within the landscape. So one example here is, for example, you have the agricultural land, and you want to further classify the agricultural land to a smaller class called irrigated cropland. So you can consider their relative proximity to water bodies. And a similar idea is actually in Lab 6, we combined the vegetated wetland and forest into the same class because spectrally they're very similar. But oftentimes we do need the wetland information. So you can actually maybe consider the dense forest near a large natural water bodies to be the vegetated wetland. So which is a simple rule. However, in some cases, if you are based on your local knowledge, your field survey, you're certain this rule can in general apply. Maybe 90% apply to your study area. You can use this contextual information, a classification, to further classify your knowledge. So really what you can do is, speaking of near water bodies, to translate this into GIS procedures, what you can do is to, first of all, you would delineate your water bodies as polygons, and then you can run a buffer tool, and then you will be able to identify, basically within your buffer are, the areas that are close to water bodies. And then within your water bodies, you can further identify, for example, near the natural water bodies, you can further identify the forest to be vegetated wetland. So, that's basically how you would do this in either ERDAS Imagine or in ArcGIS, just, as an additional GIS procedure to refine your classification. And so far, it's kind of clear that contextual classification. So as opposed to object-oriented classification, you will begin with the object and then you apply your conventional classification procedure. For the contextual classification, what you do is actually you would classify your image first by running the regular pixel-based classification, and then as a post-classification procedure, the contextual classification is used to reassign or recode your classified pixels based on the spatial proximity information or the contextual information. So, both are spatial classifiers, but the object-oriented classification will happen before you run your either supervised or unsupervised classification. However, the contextual classification happens afterwards, after you applied contextual and after you applied the supervised or unsupervised classification, then you can apply the spatial context information to refine your classification. And this is usually done through a general GIS procedure. So those are the two quick examples regarding the spatial classifiers. Oriented classification is, it's kind of because we are not really using any commercial satellite image for the project and the assignments, but for the contextual information, I felt like it's definitely something you folks can try and explore. If you are, really finishing the GIS program, I think it's an opportunity for you to, review some of your GIS knowledge and see if you can figure out how to do those to refine your classification results. And those can be really interesting things to report as part of your classification, your final project. Because I know, we have a couple projects on producing land cover maps for Chicago or some other cities. But, those are maybe you can try some interesting ideas to refine and to improve your results. Okay, so today our focus is actually the supervised classification, which is, of course, is different than the unsupervised. So for supervised classification, the general idea is you will have to teach the program what are the different classes. Really for unsupervised, you don't really have to do anything. So you just tell the computer to generate a certain number of spectral clusters, and the program will run and identify the clusters by using k-means or ISO data. But for supervised, what do you do first is you have to teach the program what are forests, what are buildings, what are the low density and high density urban, what are the water areas. So this is the classification that, in general, we would consider supervised classification is a method that requires more interactions with the analyst. Although we know, like so far, if you have been doing Lab 6, I'm sure you have, probably just see how tedious the process can be. You just generate clusters and you have to assign, label each one. And then you probably have to go back if you want to improve until you get your satisfied results. But actually what happens, the interaction where your input, the analyst input is only afterwards, after the program generates a certain number of clusters. So for supervised classification, your input happens at the beginning. So you have to select something, we call it training samples. And then your training samples will be the input data into the program for classifying the image. And also, likewise, it's going to be an iterative process in order to get the valid results. Because oftentimes after you select your first set of training samples, you will realize there's some issues with the training samples. And in the lab, you'll see, there are the additional statistical information. You can use a histogram, you can use the spectral signature plot, and to see which training sample is not good enough, which needs further refine, and then you probably have to go back and to change your training samples until you're satisfied. So either way, it's going to take a lot more time. And in general, I see a lot of publications, if they're just doing a general land use and a cover map, I see a lot of researchers prefer the unsupervised classification because, even though it's tedious that you have to assign individual clusters and label them and, go through them individually. However, it requires, in terms of the overall research design, you don't really have to study the study. Well, you don't have to research the study area beforehand, or field work is actually, you can use Google Earth to try to identify. But with supervised classification, in order to refine your training samples, it takes a lot of professional knowledge, even statistical knowledge, in order to select, the best training samples and in order to achieve better results. So, actually, like personally, I do see the use of unsupervised classification a lot, just for the simplicity. Even if it's, there may be a long process, but there's not too much of back and forth, as long as you have generated enough clusters. So for unsupervised classification, so basically we talked about training samples. So what does training samples mean? And also, as you folks can see, basically your primary work will be generating or selecting training samples. And I want to just use this as an example to show you what training samples mean. So I'm not sure is how this screen share will turn out to be on your screen, but at least for the water area, you probably see those dashed polygons. So essentially, the process of selecting training samples is about digitizing, or you draw. Actually, in order to imagine, you're using the drawing tools to draw the training sites. So for example, the 3 sites here are the training samples of the forest class. And so apparently the 3 I'm highlighting here, they are the training sites of the water class. And there are a couple down here. They're examples of training sites of the residential class. And they don't necessarily match the classification, the classes we identified in the labs, but I just want to use the figure to make sense of what we meant by training samples. So essentially, you select training samples, you identify training samples by drawing. And usually the program, so for example, ERDAS will offer you a set of different drawing tools. You can draw a point, you can draw a line, you can draw a polygon by basically like how you digitize in ArcGIS. You can draw a rectangle, you can draw a circle, you can draw a more complex shape, or you can draw, whatever you want. You can draw whatever you want. And there are some actually nice tools for the program to draw things automatically for you based on the spectral information. So those are the things you can explore in the lab. But the basic idea of selecting training samples is about drawing training samples. And also, we mentioned this a lot of times, bad data in, bad data out. So really, everyone is selecting different set of training samples. So this supervised classification is where your result will reflect how much time you spent there or how much experience you have in image classification, because really a very experienced, very careful analyst can generate maybe a 90% accurate map. However, if you just want to quickly get the homework done, your map can be 20% accurate. So, you'll see the big difference here, because it's all about how your training samples are selected. So the idea of the training samples is you select the training samples and teach the program that, look, and those pixels are the samples of first, and they represent first. And they, in terms of they represent, there are many things going on there, because you have to make sure they are representative in terms of their, if you can imagine a histogram, like basically the training samples has to be representative in terms of the overall variability. You have to select enough samples so that the program can get enough information for classifying the different land covers. And also you have to make sure there are some considerations we'll go over together, but really this is the process. Actually, a lot of research are still going on how do you select best training samples. And there, so even after 2000, there are still research going on, like they're testing how big a sample you need. So there are a lot of statistics going on, and your results is going to be very sensitive to the training sample you select. Like we mentioned, basically you select training samples by digitizing polygons or drawing polygons if you're unfamiliar with the term of digitizing. So you use the drawing tools to draw them on the on your image, on top of your image. And some of you probably figure out the term called AOI. So essentially you're drawing the AOI's area of interest within ERDA's imaging to select training samples. So ideally, of course, your training sample, speaking of a sample, we know, like even if you don't have much statistical knowledge, you still know samples means you need many pixels to make a sample, because one pixel wouldn't be representative either way. You need many samples. So you need many pixels, and the pixels will sample the spectral characteristic of the information class. So which means you have to be really you cover everything. For example, let's think about water. In Chicago, in Lake Michigan versus the Chicago River, their spectral patterns may show slight difference. Of course, every single pixel will be different. There's really rarely has identical spectral signatures, but in general, the depth of water, the water content, and maybe sediment, types of water, whether it's natural like a pool versus a natural water body, they all show very different spectral characteristics. So your sample should cover all these different variations, so that you can really teach the program that, okay, I know this is water, but this is also water. I cover all the water, but also you want to make sure that your sample is homogeneous, that your sample shouldn't have some noise, some additional information that is not relevant to water. So they have to be homogeneous. They have to be large enough. They have to sample all these different patterns. So the general idea is you want representative samples. So that's just, keep in mind the keyword. You need representative samples. And let's, go over a few things. Let me send you folks a list of things for you to consider. And this is the list of considerations we'll go over in the next 2 slides. So, so based on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, So among the 7 things, there's one element that is not relevant, or one element that doesn't matter which one. So I'm sending you the list with number of pixels, number of training sites, size, shape, location, placement, uniformity. Which one doesn't matter? There was really quick. Shape. Yeah, I think basically we can see from the previous example, the shape really doesn't matter. You can draw a circle, you can draw a rectangle, you can draw a dragon, you can draw whatever you like. Really doesn't matter as long as they're representative, as long as they're homogeneous. They represent all the different spectral characteristics. So that's true. So usually for training site selection, you need multiple sites for each information class. For each information class, we mean, for example, for water, we want multiple, because multiple would help you ensure that, well, you cover all the different variabilities of the spectral patterns. So regarding the number of pixels, by convention, you need at least 100 pixels for each class. And let's imagine whenever you select, whenever you draw a polygon or a line, or whatever way you identify your training site, in order to imagine, there is a value will tell you how many pixels you have. I mentioned briefly in the lab instructions, but also Wednesday I'm also going to give you folks an overview, just a few places you really have to pay attention to. So make sure you look at the count, like the number of pixels, because in the past I had folks coming to me like, somehow my water class it won't classify. It doesn't make any sense. My training samples look fine, but when we look at the number of pixels, actually there are only 3 pixels. That's really why you need more. So for number of pixels, it's just really about large enough to cover all the spectral variabilities. And regarding the number of samples, we also recommend having multiple, because the more different locations you have, the more variability you can cover. For example, water, we know water is highly homogeneous. So for water, you don't really need that many. So, in this idea of, of the Twin City, I may just select 2 or 3. That's really fine, because maybe you select one for rivers, and you can just also look at, as I recall, there are a couple of places which it could come from the sediments or could be pollution. So you want to select all the, the waters with different attributes. And actually, on your image, that would be different colors, actually. Some are showing the sediments. You can see they show higher reflectance, but some are darker. So you want to cover them. But also, as you folks can imagine, the buildings, you have very bright buildings, you have blue buildings, you have somewhere in between. They're just different shades. You want to select them all. So it all depends on how complex your study area is. There are some general suggestions, but remote sensing will never be that there is a set of rules that you follow and you will get your perfect results. There are a lot of, analyst input. And actually, if you're going to take another 2 or 3 more statistical classes, like doing statistical modeling and pattern recognition, or maybe take a couple more computer science, eventually you'll see all your knowledge, all your, the statistics you learn, the GIS you learn, the computer science knowledge you learn, they will eventually all help your image processing procedure. So, that's really why a lot of these remote sensing jobs, they do have higher requirements. And as I heard, they're also paid really well, because, it's not only about analysts pushing a few buttons. You run a few tools where you just, GIS also requires a lot of input, but remote sensing can be even more, just demanding a lot more statistical background. And, speaking of statistical, it doesn't really have to be that you have to get a major in statistics. It's just more about how do you generalize what you learn to this, that, of course, you can also develop the skills from, experience. You just, keep doing the same thing, and eventually you'll grow your knowledge, your skills. So number of samples, we want to also make sure we have a couple. And in the lab, so once again, because I don't want you folks to spend the rest of your lab on classifying the image. So we basically say 3 samples for the lab. And then, there will be questions for you to talk about what you're going to do in the future if you have the time to do so, to improve. Size, what I recommend is not too big because we're already doing multiple places. So each one, you don't want to be too big because if you're too big, you will be in danger of including irrelevant pixels. For example, in a river area, if you draw a too big of polygon, maybe you will include the surrounding wetland or the surrounding maybe the beach area, which are all not part of the water. So that's really for the consideration of size is we just want to make sure it's homogeneous. But also, if you're within the lake, in Lake Michigan, if you want to go bigger, that's fine because you can just draw a bigger polygon. They're still all water. But also you want to also consider this balance because you don't want your water class to dominate your classification. So size not too big as long as it's, it covers all the variations. Shape, not important. So you can draw things as you like. You can draw simple shapes. You can draw more complex shapes. And actually, I mentioned briefly, there's a tool in in ERDAS called Grow. So that's part of the drawing tool. So when you use the Grow tool, you can define a threshold for the spectral similarity and for the spatial distance. And then the Grow tool will draw a polygon automatically for you based on your threshold. So that will be, just kind of ensure a spectral homogeneity. And location. And for location, it's kind of similar to the geometric correction. We want to be, for example, if you're just looking at your landscape and somehow for a particular area, you're not sure whether it's a urban transitional land or maybe it's a fallowed farmland. It's hard to tell, and you have no knowledge. The recommendation is you just ignore it. You pick the confident places. For example, if you're pretty sure this is an airport, here is a building, you just select the confident locations because you want your samples to be accurate. So you don't want to teach the computer something wrong because if you're teaching the computer something wrong, likely, it won't be doing the classification right. So here I also want to mention the mixed pixel idea. And also so far, I think I heard some of you mentioning the term mixed pixels. So, the common problem with the 30 meter by 30 meter resolution is, when you basically imagine the 30 meter by 30 meter resolution in a complex urban area, very likely within your image pixel, you will have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So this mixed pixel problem has been the major challenge of using moderate to coarse resolution to low resolution image. So in this case, when you select samples, of course, if you're dealing with residential, there's really not much you can do. But if you're, if you can select a relatively pure pixel, for example, you can select grass area from the golf course or the parks or the cemeteries, as opposed to select the grass area from the urban, because you're not 100% sure. It's not a pure pixel, it's a mixed pixel. So the term I sent you folks earlier, the subpixel analysis was actually designed to extract under-pixel, subpixel information. So the subpixel analysis, the output, instead of categorical, they will say, for example, there is 40% of tree cover, maybe, like a 50% of grassland, and then 10% of something else. So the subpixel analysis would allow you to extract the percentage information, proportion of land cover within each pixel. And then what you generate will be multiple output. For example, you have a layer of impervious surface representing the percentage of impervious surface at each pixel. You have another layer of tree canopy cover percentage, and that will represent percentage of tree cover at each pixel. So you will have individual separate layers to represent the percentage for each land category. And another very, very important consideration is the distribution of your samples. So what we want to ensure is, we have been talking about, you want to have uniform, you want to have homogeneous samples. So what this uniform or homogeneity means is when you plot your samples in this histogram, so in order you can do that directly by analyzing your individual samples, you want to have a what we call a single peak, a unimodal distribution. So you can imagine a normal distribution. However, sometimes if you see your sample has bimodal or multimodal distribution, like 2 peaks or more, that means your sample is not homogeneous at all. So which means you should split them into 2 samples, or you can get rid of them and reselect samples. So what we want to ensure is a single peak uniform. So that's actually, comes back to the idea why you don't want your sample size to be too large, because if you select too large a sample size, too many pixels, very likely you will have this bimodal. You select everything in the lake, but depending on where in the lake, the water class can show a multimodal distribution. So once the training samples are selected, the second step is, basically automatic within the program. You will run a classification algorithm to classify the rest of the image based on your training samples. So the program will learn from your training samples. They learn, okay, here are what first pixels are like, and here are what water pixels are like, how building pixels will like, and they will apply the classification algorithm to learn from your training sample, to run the classification. So apparently the quality of your training samples matter because, well, once again, just, bad data in, bad data out. So there are many supervised classification algorithms available. So we will try the maximum likelihood classification, which has been a very, it has a long history. And also, usually now, maybe you have heard of the random forest or convolutional neural network, the CNN, as the new machine learning, deep learning tools. However, I would argue with good quality training samples, even if you use the basic maximum likelihood classification, your classification results can still be very good. So, just bad training sample will not generate good results, even if you use good, very advanced techniques, algorithms. So I want to just quickly go over how the maximum likelihood classification works. It's definitely a statistical modeling approach. So for example, here I have selected a sample of forest and then another sample of cropland. So apparently, the different samples will have overlaps, depending on how similar their spectral patterns can be. So apparently cropland as, vegetative cover will be similar to forest land. So there will be some overlaps. So the maximum likelihood classification will basically run the classification to try to maximize the probability of being of all the pixels being classified correctly. So for example, if we look at the 45 here and look at their distribution in forest and cropland, since the corresponding the intersection with the forest curve, the forest probability distribution is higher. So in this case, the maximum likelihood classification will classify the 45 as forest as opposed to cropland to maximize the probability, just so that you can really ensure the classification. So really, once again, it's going to be dependent upon how the quality of your training sample, because you want to have good samples first before the classification can be done properly. As I'm running over time, but I just want to quickly mention the review assignments, and sorry about that. So for the review assignment, we can also use more time on Wednesday to just, if you have any questions. So we have 2 days for the presentation scheduled for March the 29th and April the 5th. So everyone will have 10 minutes. I do look for some slides. Can be simple, it's up to you. You can have more visuals or more text. So essentially, I'm looking for everyone. It's an individual work. You will first select a peer-reviewed journal article related to your final project topic. So for example, if you're running land use and land cover mapping, you can find an article on land use and land cover mapping and then present the article. So basically, you can do, or if you're interested in different applications, you can do vegetation mapping or urban heat island or LiDAR. So find one peer-reviewed journal article related to your final project. So let's make sure it's really peer-reviewed. Let's avoid using like a NASA report article. Those are not really peer-reviewed. And sometimes even for the NASA report, they all come from an original peer-reviewed article. So you want to go back to the very original peer-reviewed article. And then second, so everyone will review two examples, one application from a journal article related to your final project, and the second one can be anything that hasn't been covered in class from any sources. You can use two peer-reviewed, but also you're free to use a video example from social media, from a news article, from some like educational documentary, any examples you can see. So that's your second. Altogether, 10 minutes for your presentation. And I will finalize the presentation schedule so that you know which day that you will be presenting. But I think I set the deadline to be like, no matter which day you present, your slides are due before March the 29th, just to be fair. Okay, so that's all I have today. Sorry for running over time again.